Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you all to the sixth and last lecture in our series, which is sponsored by Cheryl K. Coleman and Margaret E. Guiteau Professorship at the Oregon Humanities Center. The professorship is providing enrichment opportunities for my course about ancient Jewish art and architecture, and I'd like to thank the Oregon Humanities Center for its support. Sean Burrus is the interim curator and Andrew W. Mellon Post-Doctoral Fellow at the Bowdoin College Art Museum of Art and the co-director of the Northwest by Northeast Project, a digital initiative. He specializes in the art of the ancient Mediterranean with a secondary focus on global contemporary art and themes of migration and global connectivities. He received his PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he wrote a dissertation entitled Remembering the Righteous, Sarcophagus Sculpture and Jewish Identity in the Roman World. He's won several honors and awards. He served as the Bothmer Fellow at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Department of Greek and Roman Art, and as a fellow at the Frankel Institute for Advanced Jewish Studies at the University of Michigan. I'm excited that he will give today's lecture entitled Making Jewish Place and Marking Jewish Space, Jewish Art at Rome, Beit Shearim, and Dura Europos. Please welcome Dr. Burrus.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thanks everyone for joining today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and dive in. Let's see. There we go. Can everybody see? Looking good? Okay. So yeah, no, really appreciate this opportunity to speak to you and talk about some of the research that I've done on art in the ancient Mediterranean, and particularly Jewish art in the ancient Mediterranean. As I was talking with Dr. Seaman before, when I was doing my undergraduate degree and my PhD, classes devoted to Jewish art and architecture didn't really exist. I knew of none of them. So I think it's just so wonderful that you're studying what you're studying this semester, and to be able to be a small part of that is really welcome. So before we get started, I'll share, let me make sure there we go. A little bit about myself. So my background is in archaeology. I spent about a decade in the field excavating at different sites in Israel. Actually began at the Roman fort of Yotvata, which is in the Negev, in the southern Negev in Israel, excavating under Jody Magnus, who was my undergraduate mentor, who you heard from earlier in the semester. After excavating at Yotvata, where I dug, among other things, a Roman bathhouse, which was really fun, I moved on to the sites of Ashkelon and Sepphoris. And Sepphoris at the bottom right-hand corner, you see here the publication team that was involved in doing the final publications of that site, which had been excavated over a period of about 30 years. And one of my roles on that site was to publish the art and artifacts, the small finds, as we call them in archaeology. That is basically everything that was uncovered in the excavations that wasn't ceramics or lamps or stratigraphy or architecture. So hairpins, nails, tools, thimbles, all sorts of small finds from the site. And at Ashkelon, which was a multi-period site on the coast of Israel, I also worked on a Roman basilica and a Hellenistic household, where we uncovered an entire storeroom or cabinet of collapsed Hellenistic fine wares. You see me here taking photographs on site because across all of these excavations, one of my roles was to serve as the dig photographer. And in that role, I not only recorded daily progress, but I also photographed all the finds that were coming out of the site. And between publishing the small finds at Sepphoris and photographing the finds at all of these sites, all of that was great background training to bring me to where I am today, which is serving as a curator at this place, the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, which is in Brunswick, Maine. And it is one of the oldest public collections of art in the country. And we have over 30,000 objects of art in our collections, and they span, I always say that the Bowdoin College Museum of Art is the best global collection in the country north of Boston. And that's pretty important to me because our art spans all periods of art history and really across the globe. And my role at the Bowdoin College Museum of Art, working with faculty, collaborators, and really working across the collection, is to, rather than study any one single area of art history, to study the entire collection. And that's been a really liberating experience for me after so many years of focusing so closely in my academic training on very specific and narrow areas of expertise to really open up the box and be able to go down so many different rabbit holes, studying European prints on the one hand, or modern Mexican photography, for example, are just some things that I've done in the past few weeks alone. Now, in my research in Jewish art in antiquity, though, which I do continue to do, I deal with a wide range of art from across the ancient Mediterranean. A lot of it, I'm sure, that you've already encountered at this point of the semester. The art that I deal with includes gold glasses, frescoes, funerary reliefs, and mosaic floors. And all of the art really indicates, as I'm sure you've realized, that Jews were voracious consumers, patrons, and producers of visual culture and antiquity. Also, more often than not, this art that we encounter in the Jewish world of antiquity really complicates our notions of Jewishness, and it can help expose fault lines between ancient and modern conceptions of art. More than that, it really helps raise very broad questions about attempts to divide art into categories that correspond neatly to ethnic groups, to religious identities, or to geographic and political boundaries. To expose some of those complications and those broader questions, I want to look today at art from 3 Jewish communities. And we have here a map, various versions I'm sure you've encountered throughout the semester, showing the locations of Jewish communities in the ancient world, and particularly in the Roman Empire from between the 1st and the 5th centuries of the Common Era. And I want to look at Jewish art produced and consumed in 3 of them. We'll begin by looking at the catacombs of Beit Shearim in Roman Palestine, or ancient Israel. And then we'll look at the catacombs of the Jewish community in Rome, at the very heart of the Roman Empire. Finally, at the end of the lecture, we'll take a look at what's going on in Dura Europos. We'll cover that in a little less detail because I know you've already heard from other speakers on that subject as well. But Dura Europos was a very important cultural crossroads at the far eastern end of the Roman Empire. Now, this survey of these particular sites, these 3 sites, really helps span the Jewish world and the Jewish experience of antiquity. And it gives us a chance to compare and to contrast some of the different ways that Jewish communities, but also especially Jewish individuals, engaged art in order to navigate the Roman world and to construct Jewish identities. Now, to get to that question of individual Jews navigating cultural contexts and currents in the Roman world and consuming art, we'll look especially at sarcophagi. From the 2nd to the 5th centuries of the Common Era, the sarcophagus was the absolute height of burial fashion in the Roman Mediterranean. Sarcophagi were large stone coffins that were produced and consumed across the Roman Empire, and they were displayed according to local practices. In other words, sometimes they were put underground in catacomb complexes, and other times they were installed in open-air cemeteries or even as freestanding monuments along roadsides. Now, wealthy individuals throughout the ancient world adopted sarcophagus burials, not only to protect their bodily remains, but because they were pieces of incredible sculpture that had the really powerful impact of displaying status and cultural sophistication, but also communicating with others very intimate senses of self and identity. And in this regard, elite members of Jewish communities in the ancient world were absolutely no different than their non-Jewish neighbors. And we know of nearly 200 sarcophagi from the late ancient catacombs from the Jewish communities at Beit Shearim and at Rome. This group really neatly captures the wide range of possibilities that were open to Jewish art patrons for engaging with the visual culture of the ancient world. And it also reflects different geographic and cultural realities of diaspora, Rome, and home, Beit Shearim. But before we launch into specific examples, I'm going to very briefly rehearse the set of well-known symbols held in common by Jews across the ancient world. And I imagine that at this point in the semester, they're very well familiar to the vast majority of you. But since we have some guests as well, I think, just to make sure we're on the same page, I'll illustrate and define them very briefly for those who might not yet be familiar with them, using some images that we'll encounter again and explore in more depth later on. Because one of the common threads throughout today's discussion is that we'll focus on the ways that these symbols and others are either engaged or avoided in different Jewish contexts across the ancient Mediterranean, both within ancient Israel-Palestine and in the diaspora at sites like Rome and Dura Europos. These symbols include the Jerusalem temple, the historical epicenter of God's presence on earth, seen here in various depictions in the frescoes at Dura Europos. The Torah shrine, synagogue furnishing that housed the scrolls of the Hebrew Bible. And we see here on the left the depiction of a Torah shrine from a gold glass from the community at Rome, as well as a architectural rendering of the real Torah shrine at the synagogue of Dura Europos with a figure included for scale. The menorah, which was the seven-branched candelabra associated with both the Jerusalem temple and the ancient synagogue. The shofar or ram's horn that was blown to signal the new year, and it was also associated, like the menorah, with the rites of the temple and the synagogue. And lastly, the lulav and etrog, plant offerings of the festival of Sukkot that was celebrated in both the temple and the synagogue. So as a starting point, almost as a control, if you will, I want to begin with how these symbols are used, or as we'll see, as often as not, avoided in Israel at the catacomb complex of Beit Shearim in the Galilee. Now, the village and catacombs of Beit Shearim are situated in the foothills of the Carmel mountain range in the lower Galilee, just off the beaten track and about 20 miles inland from the nearest ports at Caesarea and Akko Ptolemais. Beit Shearim was connected by secondary roads to some of the major inland trade routes that ran north-south in the region of Roman Palestine and Syria, and it was connected by secondary roads to the coastal ports as well. Now, the village itself, which you can see here, this labeled Beit Shearim in the circle, was situated on the top of a gentle rolling hill, shown here in a topographic plan. It had a view of the Jezreel Valley below at the bottom of this map, and the catacombs of the site, the necropolis, was located on the opposite side of the hill, forming kind of a semicircle around the village and extending onto neighboring hills. You see the different catacombs discovered at the site labeled in numbers here on this plan. The site was first excavated in 1936 when Benjamin Mazar learned of a breach in the walls of a cave that was already known to locals as the Mugharat el Jahannam. And this breach had opened onto what was reported to be a decorated cave. So Mazar began what started out only as salvage excavations and ended up instead as 11 years of full-scale excavations between 1936 and 1958 that were interrupted by World War II. Now, ultimately, these excavations were conducted by two of the giants of Israeli archaeology, Benjamin Mazar from 1936 to 1940, shown here looking really sharp, almost like Indiana Jones in a leather jacket that I have never once in my life seen on an archaeological excavation. And by Nachman Avigad, who excavated the site from 1953 to 1958. Now, together, Mazar and Avigad uncovered a sprawling necropolis that spread onto adjacent hills and included over 30 catacombs with room for several thousand Jewish burials. Now, the state of the catacombs, as they were encountered by Avigad and Mazar, was not at all encouraging. Most of the tombs had been broken into after centuries of looting and decay, and bones had been disinterred and scattered across the catacomb floors. But despite this, the necropolis at Beit Shearim really remains to this day one of the richest necropolises in all of Roman Syria, including non-Jewish sites as well. And it certainly provides our best evidence for Jewish funerary practices in this time period, from the middle to the late Roman periods. On those grounds, in 2015, Beit Shearim was awarded status as a World Heritage Site, which is a very important thing for an archaeological site, and comes with it a great recognition of the historical value in understanding ancient cultures. Now, nothing that the excavators had encountered up to 1955, towards the end of the excavations, prepared them for what they came to find in Catacomb 20. And Catacomb 20 is markedly different from other catacombs in terms of both its size and its layout and its contents. Catacomb 20 featured a very large forecourt that you see here, and was entered through a monumental facade that should look rather familiar to those of you who've already probably looked at synagogue architecture in the region. Obviously, a lot of the architectural language was being drawn from what's going on at built structures in the region. The overall size of the catacomb was also remarkable. It's the largest catacomb at the site, and it had a central hallway running north-south, off of which several sub-halls branched for a total of over 26 rooms. Beyond its size, now, another thing that made the catacomb very unique was that its intended use, and here I'll just go ahead and say the intended use was to house hundreds of sarcophagi. Its intended use was taken into account in the layout, with extra floor space given over to these large pieces of sculpture, and passageways between the rooms that were wider than average at the site, in order to facilitate moving these large marble blocks that weigh over a ton apiece. Now, Avogad's description of the discovery gives a really good sense of the bewilderment of the excavation team, and also the intensely visual experience that it was to discover a burial hall that was jam-packed with sarcophagi crammed in like sardines. Avogad writes, "What was revealed before us, even in the weak light of our flashlights, was so different from what we were accustomed to in Beit Shearim that we could hardly believe our eyes. Wherever we looked, we saw rows or groups of large stone sarcophagi, all broken into. Sometimes the heavy lids were flung onto the floor. Every now and then, someone from our group would call out in excitement, 'Here are lions, here is a Hebrew inscription.'" Avogad and his team eventually uncovered a group of 125 locally produced limestone sarcophagi, as well as fragmentary evidence for another 24 or so imported marble sarcophagi from the catacombs. And these all dated to between the 3rd and the 4th centuries of the Common Era. Now, these sarcophagi are fascinating, and they provide a lot of insight into how elite Jews in the Roman Galilee saw themselves and how they engaged with the broader province and the Roman Mediterranean. Now, in order to understand the sarcophagi at the site of Beit Shearim, it's very useful to compare them to the larger sarcophagus industry in the Roman world, and especially to what's going on across Roman Syria, of which the Galilee was a part. And when we do this, we see that across Roman Syria, whether we're looking at Beit Shearim or, for example, at Tyre on the coast of Roman Syria in modern-day Lebanon, which is another giant necropolis that's probably the best comparison for Beit Shearim, there is really a hierarchy of 3 types of sarcophagi that are being produced and used by inhabitants of the region, whether they're Jews, Christians, or pagans. The hierarchy is based first and foremost on the degree of status and wealth a sarcophagus formic signal, basically how expensive it was. But it's also based on the degree to which the sarcophagus signals a certain type of interaction or trade with the larger Roman world. In other words, whether they're produced by local workshops or whether they're imported from afar. That's an important clue as well into the cultural leanings and sophistication of the patrons. Now, marble attic sarcophagi, shown here at the bottom left, were the absolute pinnacle of what wealthy patrons in Roman Syria could aspire to. And these were imported in very small numbers in the region. And because of that, they're very proudly and prominently displayed. Second, and occupying an important middle rung in the ladder, and in fact, even predominant rung, were Prokonnesian sarcophagi. These were imported marble sarcophagi from Prokonnesian workshops in Asia Minor, which is in modern Turkey. And what we can say is that Prokonnesian marble accounts for upwards of over 75% of imported marble products in Roman Syria, including sarcophagi. Now, an interesting aspect of Prokonnesian sarcophagi, though, is that they were exported from the workshops in Prokonnesian and Asia Minor in only a semi-completed form, and they were finished at ports on the coast of Roman Syria, at places like Tyre, Beirut, Caesarea, and possibly Ashkelon as well. And then finally, not only at Beit Shearim, but at Tyre and really across the entire region of Roman Syria, the overwhelming majority of sarcophagi were produced in local stone material, whether it's limestone, sandstone, or basalt, whatever was ready at hand, and in local workshops. And these provided the most affordable and also the most common means of gaining access to the prestige and the status that was associated with sarcophagus burial. So let's take a look at each of these types in turn and consider how Jewish individuals at Beit Shearim and the Galilee made use of them. First, the attic sarcophagi that were at the very pinnacle of the sarcophagus industry. Now, these were carved of a very fine-grained white marble from Mount Pentelicos that we typically call Pentelic marble, that was used in various forms of sculpture in the ancient Greek and Roman world. It was kind of the best type of marble that one could acquire, really a prized material. And now attic sarcophagi carved in this marble are sculpted in extremely high relief. Partly the marble properties itself support a very fine degree of carving and detail. They feature lots of undercarving, and they often feature very complex layered programs with narrative scenes from Greek mythology and epics. And we see here a scene from the Trojan War on a sarcophagus that was imported to the site of Tyre in Roman Syria. Now, the most famous sarcophagus from Beit Shearim happens to be an attic import called the Leda and the Swan sarcophagus for a scene on one of its short sides, a scene drawn from Greek myth of Zeus in the guise of Leda in the guise of a swan assaulting Leda. And this sarcophagus also happens to be one of the few sarcophagus at the sites that was discovered outside of Catacomb 20. It was discovered in fragments in the collapse of the mausoleum that was above Catacomb 11. Catacomb 11 was probably a catacomb devoted to a single wealthy family. And we see here an image of it, including the mosaic forecourt and architectural facade that it had, that in many ways was kind of a miniature of Catacomb 20 itself. Now, the front and rear panels of the Leda and the Swan sarcophagus shown here contained, as we might expect, narrative mythological scenes that were composed of around a dozen figures. On the front panel, at either end, are two nude male figures restraining horses. And then in between them are an intermixed group of nude youths, bearded and helmeted men, and several women who make up a very energetic scene. But the identification of this scene was really not certain until several decades after its discovery, when a very similar, almost identical attic sarcophagus was actually discovered not too far away at Tyre in modern Lebanon, excavated by Marcel Shahab. Now, in that sarcophagus, which was complete, it was very clear that the scene was of the popular myth of Achilles at the court of King Lycomedes. And we can see here with the sarcophagus of Beit Shearim on top and the sarcophagus from Tyre below, the similarities that make this identification very secure. The figures on either end restraining horses, the seated figure on the far left, who is likely King Lycomedes, and then this mixture of male, female, helmeted and bearded men throughout the rest of the composition. Now, the myth of Achilles at the court of King Lycomedes is a very popular scene from Greek mythology, and I'm taking the liberty of illustrating it here with a piece in the Bowdoin collections, early modern painting by Franz Franken. It's a scene where Achilles has been sent to the court of King Lycomedes to hide from his prophesied death in the Trojan Wars. And at the court of King Lycomedes, he's disguised as one of the court ladies, and he wears women's clothes. And Odysseus, who's rounding the Greek Isles, digging up warriors and princes to fight the Trojans, brings out a chest of treasure, including one sword in the mix. And he has one of his companions outside of the palace walls blow a horn, and Achilles, unable to hide who he really is, when he hears the battle horn go off, rather than pick up a mirror or jewelry or another trinket associated with the ladies of the court, picks up a sword and gets ready for battle. And that's a pivotal scene in Greek mythology, and really this moment of metamorphosis or transformation or climax that was really popularly displayed on so many forms of ancient art. Now, only a few fragments of the rear panel of the Leda and the Swan sarcophagus are preserved, and I show the two of them here at the bottom, but it seemed to have depicted a hunt scene. We see on the left someone wearing the garb of a hunter, including boots, and on the right, a horse rider reared up with a spear, throwing his spear at a target below. And we can just make out in the bottom of that right example some sort of animal, and an animal that seems to have these bristles along its spine, which accord with depictions of a boar in ancient art, and particularly depictions of Meleager and the Caledonian boar, which was another popular scene on sarcophagi of the period. So the Leda and the Swan sarcophagus indicates that at least one very wealthy patron at Beit Shearim was able to import Attic sarcophagi with Greek mythological scenes of heroes and gods. Now, the question is, what does this say about them? Most interpretations of sarcophagi like this at Beit Shearim have tended to reduce their cultural significance to simply fashionable designs, pretty pictures that the Jewish patrons who bought them either didn't understand or simply didn't care about. But the context in which the Leda and the Swan sarcophagus was found, to me, is really profound in this regard, and really undercuts attempts to explain away the Greek mythological character of the sarcophagus. Now, as I mentioned already, it was discovered in the collapse of the mausoleum above Catacomb 11, and a remarkable Greek inscription was also discovered in that collapse, and was probably originally affixed to the facade of the catacomb. The inscription reads, "Here I lie, son of Leontios, dead, Sappho's son, Justice, who, after I had plucked the fruit of all wisdom, left the light, my poor parents who mourn endlessly, and my brothers, alas, in my Beit Shearim. After descending to Hades, I, Justice, lie here, with many of my kin, since mighty fate willed it. Courage, justice, no one is immortal." Now, what points can we make about this inscription? For one, the deceased name is Justice, a good Latin name. And the names of his father and his mother are good Greek names, Leontios and Sappho. These names indicate a generational interaction with the Greco-Roman world. But the contents also indicate a familiarity and comfort on the part of the deceased, not only with Roman funerary conventions, but also with Roman philosophy and conceptions of the afterlife. So it's important to note, for example, the mention of this descent to Hades, the identification of fate. Moira is ultimately responsible, and the form of the exhortation at the conclusion, this courage, justice, no one is immortal. That's a very common inscription in epitaphs in the Roman world, and particularly Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Mediterranean. Now, if all of this weren't enough, to suggest that the acculturation of Justice and his family went far beyond a superficial level, suggested by just, identifying with the pleasing imagery of these motifs. The epitaph itself is composed in Homeric hexameter. That is the exact same verse structure that the Iliad, which recounts the Trojan War, was composed in. And so the connection there between the Iliad, the Trojan War, and the Leda and the Swan sarcophagus is all really, really compelling to suggest that this family would have understood, not only had access and the means to purchase a sarcophagus like this, but would have had the cultural literacy and the very deep knowledge of Roman ideas to engage with mythological scenes like this on the same terms as non-Jews and to appreciate them for what they were. Now, stepping down a rung on the ladder, turn our attention to Prokonnesian sarcophagi, which were produced on the island of Prokonnesian in the Sea of Marmara, which had easy access to the Aegean Sea and Mediterranean trade routes beyond. Now, Prokonnesian marble was a grayish marble with blue striations, and it was of slightly coarser grain than Attic marble. It was actually one of the cheapest stone materials available in the Roman world. And because of this, Prokonnesian sarcophagi were imported to Roman Syria in numbers that dwarf all others. At Tyre, for example, again, one of our best comparisons for what's going on at Beit Shearim, Prokonnesian imports outnumber other imports, including Attic sarcophagi, by a ratio of about 8-1. Now, an important detail about Prokonnesian sarcophagi is that, unlike Attic sarcophagi, they were exported in an unfinished form and finished at their places of import on the coast of Roman Syria. Because of this, we have to think of them at least partially as a provincial form, since local provincial workshops were responsible for completing the sculptural programs. And because of that, there are actually a couple of different types of Prokonnesian sarcophagi, the most well-known of which is the garlanded sarcophagi, which actually comes in two forms, the quarry state form and the finished form. Now, the quarry state form is one of the most frequently encountered across Roman Syria. At Tyre, for example, it accounted for over 2/3 of the Prokonnesian garlanded sarcophagi that we see. And it seems to have become a very popular form in its own right. These were used with very minimal adaptation from how they were exported from Prokonnesian, and the geometric forms, the roughing out of the shape of the sarcophagus was really kind of left in place and maybe received only minimal planing and smoothing of the surfaces. Only around 1/3, though, were actually finished when they reached Roman Syria, and show an example here of a garlanded sarcophagi in its finished state, where the garland swags have been worked into these naturalistic forms, and in this case, heads have been carved into these into the rondels floating above the garlands, and Nikkei have been carved at either side and in between, supporting these swags of garlands. Now, just as with Attic sarcophagi, our evidence of Prokonnesian models at Beit Shearim is fragmentary, but what we do have shows that Jewish patrons really appreciated the provincial popularity of this form. We have evidence of Prokonnesian garland sarcophagi in both quarry and finished states, and the quarry state sarcophagi were the easiest to identify. Among the many fragments that we find of this type at the site of Beit Shearim are two that I show here in photograph and in a reconstruction. And these two can be attributed, as we see, to the same sarcophagus. They show the upper right corner and a fragment of the middle of the sarcophagus as well. And one of the things that I think is really unique about this piece is it points out how this form came to be appreciated in its own right, because once it arrived in the coast of Roman Syria and was imported to Beit Shearim, the treatment that it received, the extra sculpting that it received, was not to render it in a naturalistic form, but it was to plane down the surfaces and apply these very minimal moldings to complete the form. And I think that's really interesting thing to observe. Now, several other fragments show that Jewish patrons at Beit Shearim also purchased finished forms of garlanded sarcophagi. We have two fragments shown at the top here that show clusters of grapes of the type that hung underneath the garland swags. At the bottom left corner, we see the join where a ribbon ties together two garland swags. And then on the right, we have a figural image of a Nikkei with a garland swag thrown over her shoulder. These were very common, as we've seen already, on sarcophagi of this form. We saw an example from Tyre. Now, almost as significant as these imported forms is the way that they stimulated the local stone industry as well in the sarcophagus production around the site of Beit Shearim. And we have a lot of evidence that local producers in the region of sarcophagi were copying Prokonnesian imports. We have 5 sarcophagi, 4 of them were discovered in the same catacomb chamber. We have 5 sarcophagi that imitate the quarry state of garland Prokonnesian imports. All of these were carved out of a very hard limestone, which suggests that when the intention was to mimic an imported marble form, a finer local material was used. A harder and more durable form capable of holding greater detail was chosen. But there are also a pair of sarcophagi made of that same harder local limestone, and I show you one example here, that imitate the finished form of garlanded sarcophagi. And here we see the garlanded swags, the clusters of what actually here look a little bit more like pine cones, but rosettes floating above the garland swags, and acanthus leaves on either end of the sarcophagus. Now, the level of detail on this piece and the other like it is really, really high, and it shows the degree of sculpting that local sculptors in the Galilee were capable of achieving when working with the right material and working with parallels of imported marble sarcophagi. So all of this then, from the imported Prokonnesian sarcophagi in quarry state and finished form to the local imitations, suggests that Jewish patrons at Beit Shearim were very deeply influenced by provincial patterns of patronage and sarcophagus fashions in Roman Syria, where the Prokonnesian form really reigned supreme. But these last few examples where we saw local sculptors imitating Prokonnesian imports leads me to draw a point about how local sculptors were also drawing on local sculptural traditions much more than we have previously realized in the literature. Because by the time the sarcophagi at Beit Shearim were produced, beginning in the 3rd century of the Common Era, cultural exchange with the broader Roman world had really intensified over the course of several hundred years, as I'm sure you know. The Nikkei sarcophagus from Beit Shearim is a really great example of how difficult and even pointless it can be to try to distinguish at this point in history between Roman and local culture after centuries of accrued cultural exchange. Now, this sarcophagus is named for the 2 winged figures on the front panel who flank a central rosette. And the sarcophagus was carved in a softer local limestone in a very shallow, almost flat bas relief. Now, almost every discussion of the sarcophagus in the literature argues that the Nikkei on this sarcophagus are copied directly from other sarcophagi known elsewhere in the Roman world, including from Rome and from Asia Minor. And I show an example from Turkey here. Now, some have even held the Beit Shearim example as an exemplar of how local artisans were copying imported Roman sarcophagi in the region. And it's definitely true that the symmetrical compositions of winged arrows and Nikkei with wreaths do occur on sarcophagi in the Roman world, but they're certainly not among the most common themes. Now, despite that, on the face of it, just looking at the comparison alone, it seems like a slam dunk case. But despite the existence of this parallel, there are a number of reasons to be suspicious of the notion that the sarcophagus is a locally produced copy of an imported marble. First, while Nikkei are represented in the broader corpus of Roman sarcophagi, not a single one has been found in Roman Syria, even in the coastal cities, and certainly not in the interior of the Roman Galilee, where marble imports are far rarer. Much more critically, though, closer parallels to the Nikkei sarcophagus, both stylistically and in terms of the content of the sculptural program, exist in the relief sculpture that decorated the synagogues in the region. And you may have already seen some of these, but winged figures very often decorated the lintels of synagogues in the region. And I show you here two examples. In the drawing at the top right, fragments from the synagogue at Nikkei, and on two lintels from the same synagogue at Bar Am. Now, on all of these examples, Nikkei flank a wreath and are shown holding a ribbon in the very same awkward pose on the sarcophagus from Beit Shearim. They have these upright torsos with splayed legs that are horizontally arranged, forming almost an L shape or 90-degree bend. So based on these parallels, the stylistic evidence and the lack of known Roman models in the region, at least to me, it seems much more likely that the motifs of the Nikkei sarcophagus were drawn from local traditions of stone sculpture first, where direct parallels for this motif clearly exist. Now, importantly, I'm not arguing that these motifs of these winged figures don't carry any connotations or associations with Roman culture. Certainly, at some point, these figures were adapted from Roman models to use in architectural relief carving in the local context. In other words, there's little question that originally, at least, winged victories were associated with Roman cultural influence and exchange in the Roman Galilee. But my argument is that winged figures like this had been so thoroughly embraced in the local sculptural tradition at this point that we don't need to look all the way to Rome or to imported sarcophagi for close parallels for this sculptural program. In fact, there are strong traditions of local sculpture in Roman Palestine by this point that you probably have already encountered in your classroom. So I'll just point it out briefly here. Two of them that I've focused on are the development of ossuaries, limestone boxes for gathering the bones of the deceased that were commonly decorated with geometric motifs, and particularly the rosette, as well as contemporary architectural relief carving on Galilean synagogues from the 3rd century into the Byzantine period. And these formed the basis for what was really a very strong local tradition in stone sculpture that craftsmen, sculptors working in the region of Beit Shearim and in Roman Galilee would have been versed in and could have drawn on in composing sarcophagus programs for Jewish patrons. And we do see that at the site. We see just a few examples here, but rosettes proliferate on locally produced limestone sarcophagi at the site, as do rampant animals, which we see in synagogue lintels in the Galilee, as well as other motifs that are drawn from the local repertoire of stone sculpture. Yet, while sculptors and Jewish patrons behind the 125 locally produced sarcophagi at Beit Shearim did regularly turn to these traditions as sources of inspiration, One thing that they rarely did was incorporate Jewish symbols of any kind into their sculptural programs of sarcophagi. Now, this is really interesting, and despite the fact that in the same period of the catacombs of Beit Shearim, Jewish ritual objects become popular and widely used symbols across the ancient world, marking Jewish people and Jewish places. And in fact, at Beit Shearim, as we see here from an excavation photo from Catacomb 20 itself, images of the menorah were commonly carved on catacombs walls across the site. So in light of the popularity of Jewish ritual symbols, it's very surprising that these symbols appear actually on only a single local limestone sarcophagus from Beit Shearim. And this sarcophagus was appropriately dubbed the menorah sarcophagus by Avogadro, a local limestone sarcophagus with a 7-branch menorah carved on its left side, and on the right side, a knotted wreath containing a conch shell flanked by a pair of dolphins. Now, for me, the most interesting thing about this sarcophagus is actually not its symbol at this moment, but the fact that it's an outlier. Why only one sarcophagus with a Jewish symbol? On the basis with which the menorah and other symbols appear at Beit Shearim and more generally in the Galilee, we can rule out that the absence was the result of a lack of familiarity on the part of the patron or on the part of the sculptor. Rather, any explanation that we try to offer for this paucity of motifs of Jewish symbols in the sculptural programs of sarcophagi has to assume that Jewish patrons at Beit Shearim didn't feel the need to incorporate ritual symbols in their sarcophagi for one reason or the other. Now, one thing we could hypothesize is that the menorah and related Jewish ritual symbols were actually most often directed outwardly, meant to announce to an outsider, a passerby, for example, the Jewishness of a certain space, a place, or even an individual to viewers. If this is the case, then the catacomb context of Beit Shearim, these subterranean chambers where everybody who's interred and everybody who's probably visiting the space is Jewish, the use of Jewish ritual symbols may not have been considered necessary, especially by individual patrons to mark their own burial spaces. Now, before moving on to another site and to another group of artifacts, just a very quick recap. The sarcophagi at Beit Shearim and the hierarchy of types that existed there really reflect the larger practices in Rome and Syria and demonstrate that Jewish patrons in the Galilee were very well aware of local, provincial, and empire-wide customs in funerary fashion and in visual culture. The very few marble attic sarcophagi that were imported to the site indicate that there were some patrons at Beit Shearim who had the knowledge and sophistication to access broader currents in the sarcophagus trade, as well as the cultural knowledge to appreciate the images that decorated these sarcophagi. But many more patrons at Beit Shearim seem to have been driven by provincial patterns in visual culture, and particularly by what was readily accessible and wildly popular in the region of Rome and Syria. In other words, Prokonnesian imports and local copies of those imports. But the overwhelming majority of decorated sarcophagi were produced in local limestone and drew on local sculptural traditions that were common to the Galilee. Interestingly and exceedingly rare in this group, though, or anywhere else among the sarcophagi at Beit Shearim, were the use of Jewish symbols. Now, as a way of comparing and widening the scope, I want to turn our attention to two diaspora communities that offer a great point of comparison with what's going on at Beit Shearim. And we'll begin with Rome because our best evidence for the Jewish community in Rome really comes from the catacombs in Rome, a funerary context much like Beit Shearim. Now, the Jewish community in Rome was one of the most prominent and long-standing diaspora communities in the ancient world, and it dated back to as early as the middle of the 2nd century before the Common Era. But most of our material and visual evidence for the community comes from 6 catacombs that date to the 2nd to the 5th centuries of the Common Era. And they're shown here on the map. And they really ring the city. And it's important for me always to point out that the way that they ring the city, the way that they kind of are diffused across Rome outside of the city walls, and you don't see it on the map here because these are just Jewish catacombs, but the way that they're intermingled and right next door to Christian and pagan catacombs really gives the lie to any notion that Jews lived apart from others in the Roman world in the ancient equivalent of a ghetto. Now, just to give you a sense of what the catacombs at Rome were like, we see here some images that I took from the catacombs of Vigna Rondinini, one of the few catacombs that you can still visit today. On the left, we see one of the long galleries that form the backbones of these catacombs, where the vast majority of burials or inhumations take place. And they're dug into the tufa, volcanic hills of Rome. And the individual burials are slotted into the sides of these walls in these horizontal niches, which are called loculi. And the bodies were placed horizontally parallel with the gallery, with the running of the galleries. And they were sealed with these marble, brick, or ceramic plaques called loculus seals. And I have a small example here that were often inscribed or painted with inscriptions naming the deceased and perhaps giving a few salient details. Now on the right, we have a picture, and including some of my colleagues for scale, you see a cubiculum, one of the private rooms, probably owned by individual families or small groups of wealthy families that kind of came off of the main galleries and were often decorated by elaborate frescoes. They're the equivalent of some of the nicer catacombs and mausolea at Beit Shearim. Now, we'll focus first on the sarcophagi, which, as you can tell by now, really are my area of expertise, and also the best point of comparison with Beit Shearim. But we'll also look at several other genres of art that come from the catacombs, including gold glasses and frescoes, reflecting the different ways that Jews in Rome, and particularly the elite members of the Jewish community in Rome, interacted with the visual culture of the city. Now, recall that in the period of the Roman catacombs, both at Rome and at Beit Shearim, sarcophagi were the absolute height of luxury, the ultimate status symbol of Roman funerary culture. And it also happens that Rome was one of the major production centers of sarcophagi in the Roman Empire. The remains of about 24 sarcophagi, mostly fragmentary, have survived from the Jewish catacombs of Rome. And one of the important things to note at the outset is that 11, or just under half of these, include inscriptions, all but 2 of which mention a title or an honorific owned by the deceased. And this is a really revealing fact because it suggests that the Jewish sarcophagus patrons in Rome were among the most prominent and well recognized members of their community. For example, the epitaph on the sarcophagus of Domnus reads, "Here lies Domnus, father of the synagogue of the Vernaculii, 3 times archon and twice frontistes. In peace may he sleep." Now, there's a lot of debate about in the literature about whether these titles are honorifics or whether they accord with real functional positions in the synagogues of the city. And I think we have about 10 or so synagogues mentioned across all of the inscriptional evidence in Rome. But whether they're honorific or functional, they reflect a high social standing on the part of deceased and sarcophagus patrons in the Jewish community of Rome. But I want to begin by showing you one of the sarcophagi that really first caught my attention many years ago and launched me on this trajectory of studying Jewish art. It still is, for me, a very important point of departure in discussing ancient Jewish art. And it's one of the most famous pieces of art that comes from the Jewish catacombs of Rome. It's called often the Jewish season sarcophagus because it's one example of an extremely popular type, the season sarcophagus type that was popular between the 3rd and the 4th centuries in Rome. Now, aside from one very prominent departure, The Jewish season sarcophagus is completely indistinguishable from its nearest parallels. The clypeus, which is this central rondo or tondo in the center of the sarcophagus, is flanked on either side and held aloft by a pair of winged victories and personifications of the seasons. And in the rest of the composition, interspersed are these little putti, what we call today cupids, who are shown doing various things, various fun, playful things, including stomping wine in a wine vat below the clypeus. But I'm sure that everybody immediately noticed the departure. And that is that in the clypeus, the space that, as you can see on our other examples, is typically reserved for portraiture of happy couples or individuals, a large menorah is sculpted instead. Now, just as it strikes us as immediately today, an ancient viewer must have unavoidably felt the weight of such a very obvious and even odd departure from conventions. So what do we make of a sarcophagus like this one? Well, on the one hand, the choice of a seasoned sarcophagus illustrates that most of the tastes or preferences of the patron ran towards all things Roman. They were, after all, purchasing a sarcophagus style that was really the height of fashion at the time they're purchasing it, very much in vogue. But the substitution of the menorah, the most recognizable symbol of Judaism antiquity, we have to assume that the menorah would have been recognized not only by Jews, but by Roman viewers as well, in the place of a portrait is probably best explained by some sort of deeply felt discomfort or avoidance of portraiture on the part of the patron for very particular, possibly intimate reasons. It's a very visible statement of preference, really, rejecting the common representational practice in the visual culture of Rome. So the question becomes, is this an indication of a certain taste on the part of Jewish patrons in general, a taste of avoiding, for example, portrait sculpture? In fact, and in direct contrast to the example of the Jewish season sarcophagus, one of the things that my research really has uncovered is that portraiture is far more popular among Jewish patrons than has ever been acknowledged. And from the 3rd century to the 4th, really, the Roman sarcophagus industry experienced what is known in the scholarship as a portrait boom. Portraits are featured on a wide variety of sarcophagi, worked into the lids, worked into the bodies, and even worked into the faces of mythic figures that are in the sculptural programs of the sarcophagi. Jewish patrons in this period, it so happens, were choosing from the very latest and most fashionable styles of sarcophagi popular in among patrons throughout the city of Rome. My favorite and most complete example from the Jewish catacombs of Rome happens to be a portrait sculpture of a young Jewish boy. It's a cline lid, or the lid of a cline sarcophagus, which is a small round sarcophagus that includes a figure reclining on a couch or a cline. Now, only the find spot in the catacombs of Monteverde indicated that this sarcophagus lid once belonged to a Jewish patron. Everything else about it, from the positioning and dress of the youth to the wispy hair and clothing that he wears, suggests that the sculptor and the patron of this piece were very closely following Roman sculptural conventions. A small dog even sits playfully below the child's right hand, and a pair of birds sit at the head and the foot of the cline or couch. Now, this use of pets as a sign of childhood was adopted very early on in Greek and Roman funerary portraiture. For example, we see it here on a Parian marble stele from 5th century before the Common Era, where we have a young girl holding to her chest a pair of doves and gazing intently down on them. We also see it in this 1st century funerary altar from Rome, where a young boy is accompanied by his faithful and loyal companion dog, not unlike the dog that we see on our own cline lid. Now, In opting for and privileging these signs of Roman childhood, it's important to point out equally that no markers of Jewish difference are offered in this sculptural program. Instead, the Jewish patron of our Kline portrait is drawing from visual resources that are predominant in Roman culture and would have offered a utterly conventional expression of Roman childhood to any family, to Jewish or not. Most critically, and this is, I think, the really, really important point, all of this suggests that the patron, and here, take a moment and think back to the Leda and the Swan sarcophagus and the ability to appreciate those mythical scenes, the patron of this sarcophagus held similar conceptions of childhood and the appropriate representation of childhood as other wealthy Roman sarcophagus patrons. Now, other portrait sarcophagi favored by Jewish patrons paint a similar picture. And especially popular among Jewish patrons was the so-called learned figure motif. Now, portraits of this type were popular from the 3rd and 4th centuries and generally include depictions of the deceased in the guise of philosophers, in the company of muses, and most commonly and most critically holding a certain attribute, a scroll. And that scroll is very symbolic and signals to the learning and literacy of the individual being depicted. Now, there are at least 4 fragmentary sarcophagi from the Jewish catacombs of Rome that show that the learned figure motif was popular among Jewish patrons. For example, one fragment depicts the torso of a male holding a scroll. That's what we see here. And he's flanked by a nude putti or cupid who is holding up this drapery that framed the composition. Another sarcophagus is surviving only in descriptions, and it reportedly included figures at either end. On the left side, a man in Greek garb playing a harp before a muse, while on the other end, 2 men debate holding scrolls. Now, an almost identical sarcophagus program is found on this example in Milan, where only some of the genders are actually reversed. But fragments like these suggest that some Jewish patrons were not only comfortable with portraiture as opposed to the patron of the Jewish seasoned sarcophagus, for example, but were also very eager to emphasize their social status and identity using Roman modes of representation, because nothing here suggests an effort to alter the sculptural programs to fit cultural sensitivities different from Roman ones or to include evidence of Jewish difference. Yet, as our seasoned sarcophagus demonstrates, the question of how to engage with, or even whether to engage with, the conventions of Roman portrait sculpture may have been an active issue in the Jewish community of Rome, one that could elicit very different responses. Still, the popularity of the learned figure motif among Jewish patrons is very worth noting, especially because the trope or the motif of the learned figure only represents the cultured status of the individual in a very general way. The scrolls, importantly, are never identifiable on Roman sarcophagi. The learning that's embodied within the scrolls is always left to the imagination of the viewer. So the question becomes, could an ancient Jewish viewer have seen in these scrolls perhaps a coded reference to the Torah? And if so, if they did see them that way, would they have seen the scroll as a reference to the deceased learning in Jewish law and culture? For me, I think it's important that the ambiguity of the scroll and the generic nature of the learned figure as a motif, just kind of vaguely and generally signaling idealized virtues of learning and literacy, might have offered Jewish patrons a way of simultaneously engaging Roman and Jewish conceptions of learning and literacy without having to decide between one or the other. Now, many other fragments from the catacombs of Rome indicate that Jewish patrons bought in, both literally and figuratively, to the language of Roman sarcophagus sculpture. And by far, the most common tropes on Jewish sarcophagi were putti or cupid, little stock figures. Just as in the broader corpus of Roman sarcophagi, these characters are engaged in a variety of activities on a fun variety of activities on Jewish sarcophagi. We see them at the top here, playing different games. We see them in the middle, reclining with baskets of cornucopia and fruits. And in the bottom fragment, a lid, we see them gathering grapes. Think back to the seasoned sarcophagi where we had putti stomping grapes in a wine vat. Now, we should probably understand Jewish patrons who are buying sarcophagi like these as taking part in a broader shift in the visual culture of Rome towards favoring neutral figures and themes sometime in the 3rd and 4th centuries. And that's partly because motifs like pastoral scenes, the seasons, muses, winged victories, and puttis all had a broad range of associations and lacked links with very specific Greek and Roman myths. So this is very important on stock sarcophagi or sarcophagi that were being produced to line the shelves of a workshop in advance of any buyer coming in and buying them. Because, in the absence of a commission, in the absence of a specific direction from a patron, when you're just producing sarcophagi to have on hand, figures like these could appeal to many different patrons, to pagans, Christians, and clearly Jews as well. Now, the sarcophagi of Jewish patrons at Rome then, just as at Beit Shearim, show that the rich and varied ways of elite Jews engage sculptural programs, and the way that these sculptural programs portray a sense of identity, values, and also at times their attitudes towards Roman art and visual culture. I like to think of it kind of as a balancing act that's being enacted in sculpture. And it all suggests to me, two communities really, that were actively engaged in the process of figuring out how to be Jewish and also be part of Roman society at large. But returning very quickly to the seasoned sarcophagus and recalling the fact that at Beit Shearim, there was only a single sarcophagus discovered with a clear and unambiguous Jewish symbol, the menorah. There were only slightly more discovered at Rome. And this sarcophagus happens to be one of only 3 that feature symbols in the sculptural program. The other 2 suggest almost a complete disinterest with Roman visual culture and the conventions of Roman sarcophagus sculpture on the part of the patron. They share not only a total avoidance of Roman motifs and symbols, but they flout completely the conventions and styles of Roman sarcophagi sculpture. What do I mean by that? Well, the Jewish seasoned sarcophagus, you'll recall, for the most part, adopts the conventions of Roman sarcophagus sculpture, and its figural program and its sculptural program really mirrors everything we would expect to find, except for that one important detail. These look nothing like Roman sarcophagi that we encounter in the other catacombs. To the ancient viewer in the city of Rome, whether they were Jews or not, these sarcophagi would have appeared completely foreign and utterly bizarre. Whereas most of the sarcophagi that we've encountered would have appeared pretty much conventional and pleasantly familiar. But let's stick to these symbols for a second, because the same symbols appear on a dozen bases of gold glass bowls, objects that were popular in the 4th century among Romans of all stripes. Now, like sarcophagi, gold glasses in the funerary context were individual funerary objects, and they were most often found embedded in loculus seals of the catacomb galleries. Now, in the place of mythic heroes, saints, and portraits that predominate on Christian and pagan examples, the overwhelming majority of Jewish gold glasses display the same basic set of Jewish ritual and symbols arranged across 2 registers: the Torah shrine, the menorah, the shofar, the lulav, and the etrog. Now, an interesting component here is just as the Jewish individuals who had these gold glasses were adapting a common Roman practice of embedding gold glass into loculus seals as a marker of identity, there's also the question of whether they were adapting these in daily life in Rome as well, because gold glasses had a pre-existing life before their use in the catacomb. You can see from these pictures that they're not perfectly produced rounded rounded shapes. They're in fact chipped off of larger gold glass bowls. They're the bases, the bottoms of gold glasses. And the gold glasses were used, gold glass bowls were used in most contexts in Rome in toasting and in feasting and in banqueting for offering cheers, essentially. They even include inscriptions, a lot of them, Pie Zasis, to life. And so the question becomes, just as they're adapting these in the catacomb context, were Jews also adapting this type of artifact and art in daily life as well, and in the life of the community, taking this form that was used in Roman feasting and banqueting and perhaps applying it to rituals around the Jewish Sabbath and Jewish festivals, and thereby applying what may have been more appropriate imagery to the objects. Now, a similar predilection for Jewish symbols is also displayed in the frescoes of the Roman Jewish catacombs. And we see here an arcosolium at Torlonia, where a pair of lit menorahs flank a Torah shrine. The Torah shrine, I have a detail on the left. Its doors are open and the scrolls are arranged on two tiers, visible to the viewer. And on either side, the menorah on the left is flanked by a lulav branch and a stylized vase, while the menorah on the right is flanked by a shofar and an etrog. In the same cubiculum, the arcosolia, or the ceilings of these, the vaults of these arcosolia, were decorated with menorah as well as in the top we see on the left a lulav and etrog together, and myrtle branch, as well as a Torah scroll. And in the bottom vault we see a menorah flanked by a shofar and the lulav, etrog, and myrtle branch as well. Now, these symbols were also found at Dura Europos, and I'm going to breeze through Dura Europos real quick in the last 10 minutes. So bear these images in mind. Now, unlike Beit Shearim or Rome, where we're looking at works of art that spoke mostly to individual identities in the funerary context, at Dura, of course, we're looking at communal space, at the synagogue and the frescoes that decorated it. Now, the city of Dura, as you probably know by now, was founded sometime around the year 300 before the Common Era by colonists of the Seleucid Hellenistic dynasty. And it was subsequently ruled by Parthians until the late 2nd century of the Common Era, when it was taken over by the Romans until its destruction following a Sasanian siege in the year 256. And this siege actually is responsible, and the preparations for this siege, as you may know, is responsible for the preservation of the frescoes at the synagogue. Now, the synagogue was situated against the city wall, and it was the fortification of the city wall, the dumping of piles of earth and sand, that protected the frescoes that lined the walls. Now, in the Roman phase, the synagogue precinct actually underwent some renovations and expansions. It took over an adjacent house, and its courtyard and assembly hall were expanded. And the interior of the hall was decorated with the magnificent frescoes that you've encountered already. And today, around 30 panels of the frescoes, or 60% of them, the original count, are preserved. These illustrate events of Jewish history that are recounted in the Hebrew Bible, including the infancy of Moses, the parting of the Red Sea, and the ark in the land of the Philistines. But for our purposes today, I really want to focus in on the Torah shrine and its painted program, because the Torah shrine was the focal point of the hall, both spatially and visually. It was not only axially aligned with the entrance to the assembly hall, and we see that alignment here indicated by the blue arrow, but it also held the scrolls of the Hebrew Bible and the Torah during liturgies. And so because of that, it was a focal point of worship services and prayer. Now, architecturally, the Torah shrine featured a raised niche set between two engaged columns surmounted by a molded stucco conch. The major portion of the Torah shrine, though, shown here in an excavation photo and a watercolor reproduction done before its removal, was painted with panels of solid colors and geometric bands that mimicked polychrome marbles. And the face of the arch above the niche is really where our attention is drawn. There, predominantly displayed at the very center against a blue field, is a frontal depiction of the Jerusalem temple painted in a rich golden yellow. 4 Corinthian columns support a molded entablature with antefixes, and they contain a central feature that has been alternatively identified as the temple doors or the Ark of the Covenant in the temple cella. Now, to the left of the temple in this depiction, also in gold, is a large menorah on a tripod base and a depiction of the lulav and etrog. Now, on the right, in a different color, in this grayish color, is a depiction of a narrative scene, the binding of Isaac, something we haven't talked about yet, but a very pivotal event in Jewish history, an event that established animal sacrifice in Israelite religion and further grounds any interpretation of this program in the Jerusalem temple and in its cult practices. Now, how do we understand symbols like these across the Jewish world of antiquity from sites like Dura Europos, Rome, and Beit Shearim? Why did some Jews choose to employ them in some places and other Jews avoid them in other places? So bearing in mind that images in art always have multiple meanings embedded in them and sometimes conflicting, sometimes not mutually exclusive meanings, I want to conclude our talk today by offering 3 possible interpretations of Jewish symbols that we've encountered that I tend to employ in different contexts because I don't think that they're mutually exclusive by any stretch. Now, the first possible interpretation, and perhaps the most familiar interpretation, one that you've encountered in a lot of the historical literature on the subject, is that these symbols participate in a collective project of constructing memories of the Jewish past. The theorist of diaspora, Kasheg Toloyan, has highlighted acts of quote unquote returning as a very critical facet of maintaining a sense of communal identity in the face of collective challenges like diaspora or Roman imperial domination, which were faced by communities at Rome, Dura, and Beit Shearim. Now, Toloyan defines these returnings as a repeated, and here I quote, turning to the concept and or reality of the homeland through memory, written in visual text, travel, gifts, and assistance, or etc. So enacting this idea of orienting oneself and one's community through specific concrete acts or material and visual culture. And in many ways, the symbols we've encountered provide evidence of a similar orientation or returning in Jewish communities by invoking collective memories of historical and spiritual centers of ancient Judaism, and particularly the temple. The most obvious example here is the depiction of the Jerusalem temple that we encounter at Dura. And it's important to point out that across the late ancient Jewish world, Torah shrines were very closely associated with the Jerusalem temple, both through visual and architectural hints and allusions. And this is something that Stephen Fine has done a lot of very important work on, and is also encountered in Jewish literature of the period. Now, the Torah shrine at Dura gives us a good sense of the nature of this historical allusion or association. Notice, for example, the parallels in architectural forms between the physical Torah shrine at Dura on the right and the image of the temple that is surmounting the Torah shrine above it. Notice, for example, the conchas embedded in these niches and the way they're supported on these engaged columns. This visual association, visual and architectural association, is further cemented by the appearance of both the Ark of the Covenant and the temple on two panels in immediate juxtaposition with the Torah shrine itself. And I show here the location of those panels and insets of the panel themselves. This juxtaposition of the physical Torah shrine with images of the ancient temple and the Ark of the Covenant would have added a sense of sanctity to the Torah shrine by associating it with the Jerusalem temple of old. Similar allusions can be suggested for the menorah, the shofar, the lulav, and the etrog, because all of them were iconic cult objects and offerings described at length in the Torah or Hebrew Bible and sustaining very deep connections with the cult practiced at the Jerusalem temple. The way these objects are paired with a depiction of the Jerusalem temple on the Torah shrine at Dura is certainly suggestive in this regard. But so too is the way they're paired with the Torah shrine as a miniature temple on the catacomb wall paintings and on so many gold glasses. Now, by recalling past cult practices in the temple for Jewish viewers, these images could have been providing links to Jewish history and creating a visual connection that linked Jewish communities across the Roman world with an ancestral homeland and a remembered shared past. But to mythologize the past is very often to de-emphasize and ignore the present and the very real experiences and practices of the Jewish world and the Roman Empire. And so in this regard, I want to observe that Jewish communities, despite partaking, as we've seen, in very full and varied ways in Roman culture, did also maintain differences of religion, culture, and language, which contributed to a way of life that was different from that of the majority population in the Roman world. Now, in this context, communal institutions such as the synagogue do critical work in constituting communities and creating collective senses of Jewish difference. The synagogue functioned not only as a center of religious worship and as a space of ritual practice, but it was also a space for the practical and political organization of the Jewish community, a critical means by which Jewish difference was observed and preserved. So think for a second about the gold glasses. Considering this interpretation focusing on the local and real experiences of Jewish communities, I could easily suggest that the particular items that are displayed in them and their arrangement into registers actually alludes to the real spaces of local synagogues encountered and experienced by Jews in each of these communities. It's important here that the use of registers to convey spatial arrangement and spatial organization was a longstanding convention in Roman art. And also that the use of these exact ritual objects and furnishings is well evidenced in synagogue worship of the period. So, for example, the continued use of the menorah in the synagogue is confirmed by accounts in rabbinic literature and also by the discovery of freestanding menorahs at late ancient synagogues at Sardis that we see here, but also at Hamat Tiberias, Maon, Susia, and Eshtemoa. What's more, the shofar, lulav, and etrog in particular, which were connected to biblical festivals, were also used in festivals that continued on to be celebrated in the late ancient synagogue. And as such, they may even allude to the keeping of the Jewish calendar, a facet of Jewish life that was shared across the Jewish world of antiquity, and it was actually observed against the grain of the common calendar. Now, some of the most memorable stories of the Talmud actually deal with the difficulty of keeping dispersed Jewish communities across the Roman world on the same calendar page, literally, and indicate the centrality of the Jewish calendar to Jewish practice in late antiquity. Now, our third and final interpretation considers these symbols as responses to the experience of diaspora and empire. And many more recent approaches to communities in diaspora or in colonial and imperial contexts tend to highlight the importance of maintaining connections between communities that are scattered across different regions or under colonial regimes. Daniel Boyarin, who's perhaps our best diaspora or theorist of the ancient Jewish diaspora, suggests that what renders, and here I quote, Jewry diasporic are the connections with other Jews in other places all over the world, owing to common cultural discourses and practices. So were these symbols part of those common cultural discourses and practices? I could easily argue that the objects displayed at Beit Shearim, at Rome, at Dura, are uniquely ubiquitous in Jewish communities across the ancient Mediterranean world, and that their widespread popularity suggests more than anything else that their meaning was neutral enough to have appealed to diverse individuals and diverse local contexts. So an emphasis on the importance of sustaining connections between communities suggests that the message of these symbols may have less to do with the Jewish past or even contemporary Jewish practice, and more to do with the desire to cultivate symbolic connections across differences and across distances and across diaspora. In depicting this familiar group of Jewish symbols, ancient Jewish communities and individuals may have been visually marking their Jewishness by symbolically linking themselves to the global and Jewish diaspora community. Now, by way of concluding, final slide, just very quickly, I want to call attention to the way in which ritual symbols are combined here on our Jewish season sarcophagus, so familiar by now, with an otherwise unremarkable Roman figural program of seasons, Nikkei, and putti, or cupids. What's important to point out at this point is that no tension between the two, between Jewish symbols and Roman symbols, was perceived by this sarcophagus patron. Artifacts like these, and we know of dozens of them, suggest that for most Jews in the ancient world, whether they're at Rome, at Beit Shearim, at Dura Europos, there was no essential conflict or tension felt between being Jewish, being local and provincial, and being Roman, between partaking of all of those identities at once. And I'll return to Daniel Boyarin again here, because I think Daniel Boyarin has a really good way of putting it, and that is that our desire to kind of disentangle these different identities and hold Jewish identities separate from Roman ones and think that people behave differently in one place than the other ignores the fact that in our own experience, for example, these hybrid identities are lived out on a day-to-day basis. And that to try to disentangle a single individual into separate Jewish and Roman identities, or to make an analogy to today, separate Jewish and American identities, would be to do violence to the cohesiveness of an individual identity, as Boyarin puts it, to schizophrenize the individual. And I think that's a really astute observation. And I think that that combination, that creative combination, and that outpouring of a hybrid identity is really wonderfully witnessed here in the Jewish season sarcophagus. So I will end there, and I am happy to take any questions. I hope you enjoyed looking at some of these things today, and I hope that some of them were unfamiliar to you, or I gave you new ways to think about them.
Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. If you stop sharing your screen, you'll be on the main screen now. We have time for a couple of questions. If anyone would like to type them into the chat, I can read them to Dr. Burrus. I have a question to start off. You had mentioned the local significance of the items depicted in the gold glass. Do you have any thoughts about the differences that we see in the Torah shrines depicted on them?
Yeah, no, that's great. So we know that the Torah shrine was a very popular image, and I think this was a moment in time at which synagogue practice was still very much in flux, and we see the Torah shrine depicted with closed doors, with open doors, looking more like the temple, looking less like the temple. And I think it accords the fact that the Roman world was a period of the late Roman world was a period of great change for the Jewish community, and one in which we're really navigating. I mean, this is the emergence of diaspora Judaism as we know it and as we continue to live it today, in large part, and navigating what does it mean to be Jewish in the midst of as a minority community, really. How do we practice Judaism? The Torah shrine obviously was a fundamental part of that, and the Torah itself was a fundamental part of that. The Talmud, rabbinic Judaism, is still fighting for ascendancy time period. So I think one of my favorite depictions of the Torah shrines is when it's shown in Rome so frequently with the doors open. And I wonder often whether those doors open depicting the scrolls is a way of equating or trying to draw an analogy between Jewish law and Jewish learning and the emphasis on learning and literacy in the Roman world, and particularly what we call the second sophistic movement in Roman culture in the second and third centuries of the Common Era, when there was a renewed attention to Greek literature, scrolls, learning, and literacy on the part of wealthy individuals in the city of Rome. Often we credit the Emperor Hadrian with kicking off this fad. But I actually really wonder, it's hard for me, I mean, it's kind of a tenuous link, but whether some of the diversity of depictions of the Roman scrolls has to do with those local contexts and whether Jews were tweaking the depiction of the Torah to fit with certain things that are going on in the larger culture, like an emphasis on scrolls and learning and law among Romans. So it's a great question.
Well, thank you so much. Well, this ends our series today, and I'd like to thank the Oregon Humanities Center for the Coleman-Gateau Professorship that funded the series. And I'd also like to thank the staff at the Oregon Humanities Center for helping us facilitating the lectures on Zoom. I'd like to direct and I also like to thank all of our speakers too in the series. I'd like to direct everyone watching this to the YouTube channel that the Oregon Humanities Center runs, where you can find many of the lectures in the series. So thank you very much to Dr. Burrus, and thanks all of our speakers, and thanks to the Humanities Center, and thanks to all the attendees as well. Thanks very much.